Hello, friends. Night has already fallen, and the day was long and tiring. And now, it is time to rest. As always, I will tell you a kind legend that once took place in our beloved Middle-earth. So, settle in comfortably, gently close your eyes, and let our journey begin. In the elder days, before the sun had long journeyed across the heavens, the black hand of Morgoth lay heavy upon the north. From his iron fortress of Angband, he ruled with fear and fire, his hosts of orcs and balrogs spreading ruin across Beleriand. Yet even in those shadowed years there were places beyond his reach, strongholds of light and courage where his malice could not yet tread. Among them was one he hated above all others, though its name was veiled from his servants, Gondolin, the hidden city. Long ago, when the Noldor had first come from Valinor, Turgon, son of Fingolfin, had wandered far in secret and found a valley surrounded by mountains so high and perilous that none could pass, save by one narrow way. There, guided by the will of Ulmo, Lord of Waters, he built a city of white stone and silver towers, hidden from every eye of evil. Its fountains sparkled beneath the stars, its walls shone with moonlight, and its people, the Gondolindrim, lived in peace and splendor, while war and darkness raged beyond the encircling mountains. To Morgoth, whose pride was as boundless as his cruelty, this unseen city was an insult that gnawed at his very soul. He had smitten kingdoms and broken lords, yet there remained this fortress of beauty, untouched by his hand. His spies whispered rumors of a hidden city in the west, where the exiled Noldor thrived, and where Turgon, whom Morgoth hated most of all, ruled in glory. In the black halls of Angband, Morgoth's wrath grew as slow and deadly as frost, creeping through stone. He remembered Turgon's defiance at the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the battle of unnumbered tears, when the armies of the Eldar and Edain had risen against him and been crushed. Morgoth had triumphed that day, yet Turgon had escaped his grasp, withdrawing his hosts like shadows into the mountains. "Let him hide," Morgoth had said then, his voice deep as thunder in the deep places of the world. "No wall or mountain shall withstand me forever. There is no secret that the black foe cannot uncover." And so he began his patient vengeance. He sent forth spies, wolves, bats, and treacherous men to seek any whisper of Gondolin. But the encircling mountains were guarded by the watchful eyes of the eagles of Thorondor, and no servant of Morgoth came near without being cast down from the skies. Yet Morgoth's hatred did not cool. He was the first of the Valar to fall, and his cunning was as deep as the roots of the world. For many years he gathered every scrap of knowledge, every rumor carried by slaves and wandering foes. A captured scout of the House of Hador once spoke of a shining host seen in the western hills long ago. Another whispered of fountains that ran sweet and clear beneath the stars, and of a valley lit as if by starlight even under cloud and darkness. Morgoth heard and remembered, but it was not until the coming of one dark-hearted soul that the first true shadow fell upon Gondolin. Maeglin was his name, the son of Eorl the Dark Elf, and Aradhel, sister of Turgon. He was born between shadow and light, for though his mother was of the royal line of the Noldor, his father was of the Sindar, who loved the deep forests and hated the light of the sun. When Aradhel fled from her husband and returned to Gondolin, Maeglin followed her. Turgon received him gladly, loving him as a nephew. Maeglin grew tall and strong, a great smith and warrior, yet in his heart was envy and desire, for he loved Idril, the king's daughter, and she loved another, Tuor, the mortal man sent by Ulmo. From that love, unreturned, sprang the doom of Gondolin. But this tale does not yet come to its end, for in those years before the fall, Turgon ruled in peace, and the Gondolindrim grew proud of their strength and hidden safety. Beyond the mountains, the lands of Beleriand burned beneath Morgoth's hand, but in the valley of Tumladen, white towers rose higher, and songs of joy echoed through marble halls. Yet Turgon was not blind. He knew that no fortress was eternal, and that the dark enemy would never forget him. Therefore, he sent forth his captains in secret to watch the borders of the realm, and to learn of the world beyond their walls. Among these captains were Ecthelion of the Fountain, whose voice was fair and whose spear was strong, and Glorfindel of the Golden Flower, who shone like sunlight upon his helm. Together they led small companies through the hidden way of the mountains, scouting the lands that once had been free, now crawling with Morgoth's hosts. It was upon one such journey that our tale begins in earnest. Far from the safety of Gondolin's white walls, Ecthelion and Glorfindel rode through the shadowed foothills of the encircling mountains, following the winding course of a half-frozen stream. The air was bitter with frost, and the wind carried distant echoes, clangs of hammers, the snarling of Orcish tongues. Smoke rose faintly on the horizon. Ecthelion reined in his steed. "Angband's reach grows long," he said softly. "These hills once belonged to the house of Hader." "Aye," Glorfindel answered, his golden hair glinting beneath his hood, "and yet they are now but ashes. Still, we are bound to look beyond, for Turgon must know what storms gather beyond our gates." So they pressed on, unaware that in the pits of Angband, Morgoth's gaze had already turned toward them. For in his dark throne room, beneath the Iron Crown, the Lord of Darkness smiled, a smile cold as the void before the world was made. He had heard whispers that day from a trembling orc captain who had fled from a battle in the east. The wretch spoke of fair warriors who came from nowhere and vanished again like phantoms, whose armor shone even in moonless night. And Morgoth knew then that his hunters were close. He leaned upon his black mace, groaned, and said, "The scent of Gondolin is upon the wind." Then, with a word of power, he sent forth a new order, one that would draw his wrath ever nearer to the hidden city of Turgon. The dawn was pale and thin when Ecthelion and Glorfindel came upon the desolation that once had been a fair land. Before them stretched a wide plain, scarred with blackened pits and the ruins of old strongholds. The stones still bore the marks of flame, and the wind carried with it the scent of ash and iron. "This was once Dor Lomin," Glorfindel said quietly, dismounting. He knelt beside a fallen wall and brushed away the frost, revealing carvings beneath, runes of the house of Hador. "Here lived the kinsmen of Hur and Hurin, brave men who fought beside us in the Nirnaeth Arnudiad." Ecthelion looked out across the ruined plain, his grey eyes shadowed with sorrow. "And now their sons are slaves in Angband, or lie beneath these stones. Yet still Morgoth's wrath grows. We must learn what moves in his lands, or Gondolin herself may share this fate." They rested briefly, drinking from the icy stream, then rode onward. Their path wound through the hills, where twisted pines clung to the rocks, and the earth lay frozen and dead. All was silent, save for the moan of the wind and the dull ring of hooves upon stone. As night fell, they found shelter in a shallow cave and kindled a small fire, shielding it with cloaks lest it be seen. There they spoke in hushed voices, for the darkness beyond seemed alive with unseen things. "Do you think Morgoth knows of us?" Glorfindel asked at last. Ecthilion's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword. "He knows there are still those who defy him. Whether he knows we come from Gondolin, I cannot say. Yet his hatred seeks us, even if his eyes do not." They slept lightly, blades close at hand. In the deep of night, the cry of a distant wolf echoed through the hills, long and mournful. When morning came, the world was veiled in mist. They broke camp and continued eastward, following faint tracks that led toward the shadow of the mountains beyond. But soon they realized they were no longer alone. At first, it was only a sense, a prickling in the air, a silence too perfect to be natural. Then Glorfindel, whose sight was keen, raised his hand. "Look," he whispered. Upon the ridge above them moved dark shapes, slender and hunched, with gleaming eyes that caught the faint light. "Orcs," Ecthelion breathed. "Too many to face in the open." They turned their steeds and rode hard into the narrow valleys, the thunder of pursuit behind them. Arrows hissed through the mist, striking sparks upon the stones. Ecthelion led the way, weaving through the winding paths he had studied from maps in Turgon's hall, while Glorfindel guarded their rear, his golden hair streaming like fire in the cold wind. The chase drove them for hours. When at last they reached a rocky hollow hidden beneath an overhanging cliff, they dismounted and drew their blades. "They are close," said Ecthelion, his breath misting in the chill air. Glorfindel smiled faintly. "Then let them come." The first orcs burst into the hollow, snarling. Ecthelion met them head-on, his spear flashing like silver lightning. He struck one through the throat and spun to parry another's axe. Glorfindel moved beside him with swift, graceful fury, his sword glittering with golden fire. The battle was fierce and swift. The narrow space worked to their advantage, for the orcs could not surround them. One by one they fell, until the ground was littered with dark forms, and the air reeked of smoke and blood. When all was done, Glorfindel leaned upon his blade, his face pale but resolute. "That was no common patrol," he said. "These were scouts from Angband. Morgoth's hand is near." Ecthelion nodded grimly. "Then we must turn back. Gondolin must be warned." But even as he spoke, a shadow passed over them, a sudden dimming of the light, though no cloud crossed the sky. The horses screamed in terror, rearing and breaking free. From above came a terrible shriek, shrill and cold, that made the very stones tremble. Glorfindel's eyes widened. A creature of the pits. Out of the mist it came, a great winged beast, black and vast, its scales glistening with malice. Upon its back rode a tall figure, cloaked in darkness, bearing a spear of obsidian that burned with sickly fire. Ecthelion knew then that this was no mere orc, but one of the Balrogs, captains of Morgoth's wrath, long unseen beyond Angband's gates. "Back!" he cried, seizing his shield. "We cannot stand against such a foe here." They fled through the ravine, the creature's screams echoing behind them. Fire burst from the rocks where the Balrog's spear struck, sending shards of stone flying. The air grew choking hot, and the scent of brimstone filled their lungs. Reaching the narrow pass that led toward the hidden road, Ecthelion turned. "Glorfindel, go! Warn the king!" But Glorfindel shook his head, his eyes bright with defiance. "No, my friend. I will not leave you." Together they faced the pursuing flame. The Balrog came upon them like a storm, its whip of fire lashing through the air. Ecthelion's shield melted under its heat, yet he thrust with his spear and struck the creature's thigh. It roared, staggering, and Glorfindel seized the moment, casting a spear into its breast. The blow did not slay it, but it reeled, its fury turned to pain. "Now!" cried Ecthelion. They scrambled up the rocky slope, stones sliding beneath their boots, until they reached a high ledge overlooking the valley. The Balrog climbed after them, claws gouging the stone. At the edge, Glorfindel turned once more. "By the light of the Valar, you shall not pass this day." With a cry he leapt, driving his sword deep into the Balrog's chest. The creature shrieked and grappled him in its burning arms. Fire and golden light mingled as they fell together into the abyss below. Ecthelion called out his friend's name, but only silence answered. Smoke rose from the depths, and the roar of distant fire faded. Then, from the far side of the ridge, horns sounded, the clear notes of Gondolin's watchmen. Reinforcements had come, drawn by the clash. Ecthelion bowed his head in grief, but turned away, his heart heavy. Glorfindel's sacrifice had bought them time. The Balrog was slain, though its shadow would haunt him forever. When at last he returned to Gondolin, bearing the tidings of battle and loss, Turgon stood long in silence before his throne. Then he said, "The enemy draws nearer. We must prepare, for Morgoth's hatred will not rest until all we have built lies in ruin." And far away, in the dark halls of Ongband, Morgoth learned that one of his captains had fallen. His fury shook the mountains, yet beneath his wrath there stirred a cold satisfaction. For if his servants had found resistance, then they had found a trail. He turned his burning gaze southward, toward the mountains that hid Gondolin, and whispered, "Let the hunt begin." The bells of Gondolin rang in mourning for 7 days, and their sound carried across the valley of Tumladen like a lament for ages past. The people gathered in the great square beneath the white tower of the king, where banners hung in black and silver, fluttering softly in the still air. Glorfindel of the Golden Flower was gone, fallen in battle beyond their walls, and though his body was never recovered, the memory of his valor burned bright in every heart. Turgon stood upon the steps of his hall, tall and grave, his face shadowed by grief. Beside him stood Idril Celebrindal, her hair like the pale light of morning, and Tuor, her husband, silent and watchful. At the king's side also was Ecthelion of the Fountain, his arm bound in white linen, for the fire of the Balrog had seared him deeply. When the morning ended, Turgon gathered his council in secret. The captains came, the lords of the 12 houses, Rodge of the Hammer of Wrath, Galdor of the Tree, Egalmoth of the Heavenly Arch, and others noble and strong. The chamber was silent, save for the crackling of torches and the whisper of robes upon stone. Ecthelion spoke first, his voice steady, though his heart was weary. "My lord, the enemy's servants have passed the northern slopes. The Balrog we slew was no chance wanderer. It was a hunt sent forth by Morgoth himself. His gaze turns toward us, though he does not yet know our gate. We must prepare." Rodge struck his gauntleted fist upon the table. "Then let us strike first. If we sit behind our walls, the doom Ulmo foretold will find us all the same." But Tuor lifted his hand. "Ulmo warned us that no might of arms would long protect this city if Morgoth's hatred found the way hither. The hidden city must remain hidden, or it will be destroyed. We must strengthen the secrecy of the mountains and close the road behind us." Egalmoth frowned. "Close the road? Would you trap us here like birds in a cage?" Tuor's eyes met his, calm and firm. Better a cage unbroken than one that burns. For a long time they debated. Some spoke of sending scouts to deceive the enemy with false trails. Others urged to arm every citizen for war. Yet in the end, Turgon's word was final. "We will not abandon Gondolin," he said. "Here shall stand the last light of the Noldor. Let Morgoth seek. He will find only shadows." So it was decreed that the city's defenses be strengthened. New towers were raised along the inner walls, and the watch upon the mountains was doubled. The 7 gates that guarded the hidden way were repaired and made stronger than before. Ecthelion oversaw the training of the guard of the fountain, while the craftsmen of Meglin's house forged weapons of strange strength and beauty, blades that glimmered faintly blue when the servants of evil were near. But in the heart of Meglin there stirred envy and disquiet. He had long borne secret hatred toward Tuor, whose courage and love had won the favor of Idril. Though he hid it well, the seed of treachery had already begun to sprout. One night, as the city slept beneath the clear stars, Meglin walked alone upon the high terraces of Gondolin. His eyes turned westward, toward the encircling mountains, where the faintest glimmer of light marked the hidden way to the world beyond. He thought of power, of glory, and of his own discontent. "Why should I live in shadows?" he murmured, "while a mortal man sits beside the king's daughter? Why should Gondolin remain forever hidden, when it could rule all Beleriand?" Far below, the fountains sang softly, and the wind carried the distant murmur of voices from the lower streets. Yet Meglin heard another sound, a whisper that was not the wind, faint and cold, threading through the air like a memory of iron and flame. He turned, and for a moment thought he saw a shadow upon the farthest wall, darker than the night around it. But when he looked again, it was gone. Still, the whisper remained. In the deep pits of Angband, Morgoth brooded. His spies had brought tidings of a golden warrior slain in the mountains, and of a fair lord who had escaped fire and death. From these scattered fragments, he drew a terrible conclusion. "Gondolin," he said softly, the word twisting like venom on his tongue. "So it is not a dream." He summoned his captains, the Balrogs that remained, and among them Gothmog, the greatest of their number. "Seek the hidden valley," Morgoth commanded. "Search the peaks, the rivers, the caves. Let the skies burn with winged beasts, and let every stone be overturned. Find for me the path to Turgon's city, and I will make its ruin a song of fire that the world shall never forget." For many years his servants scoured the north, but the eagles of Thorondor guarded the mountains, and no foe crossed unseen. Yet Morgoth's will was patient. He waited as stone waits, knowing that time itself is a weapon. Back in Gondolin, peace lingered like a fragile dream. Festivals were held once more, and the laughter of children echoed through the streets. Yet beneath the joy lay unease. The king grew older, and the light in his eyes dimmed, though his will remained unbroken. Idril often walked the walls, gazing toward the mountains with quiet fear. Tuor comforted her as he could, but he too felt the shadow lengthening beyond the walls. Then one winter morning, a company of miners came before the king. They had been delving for ore beneath the northern slopes, beyond the lower halls of Meglin's smithies, and had found strange signs. Fissures opening into the rock, air that smelt of smoke and iron. "It is as if fire stirs beneath the roots of the mountain," said their leader, bowing low. We dared go no further. Meglin was summoned to examine the report, for he was master of the forges. He spoke lightly, saying that such tremors were of the earth itself, and of no concern. Yet afterward he went alone into those lower tunnels, bearing a lamp of blue flame. There, deep under the stone, he found what the miners had feared, a tunnel not of elven craft, but torn as if by claws, leading into darkness. The air was foul and hot, and a dim red glow pulsed faintly in the distance. He stood long, staring into that abyss, and the whisper came again, soft and insidious. "You are not loved here, son of darkness. They will never grant you what you desire. But I will." Meglin trembled, for the voice seemed to echo both from the rock and from within his own heart. "Who speaks?" he whispered. The voice laughed softly, like the grinding of iron. "I am the one who can give you all you seek. Come when you are ready, and the world shall bow before you." When he returned to the city, his face was pale, and his eyes shone with strange fire. From that day, Meglin spoke little, though his work grew more wondrous, and his forge burned late into the nights. None guessed the darkness that had begun to creep into his heart. And far below, through the secret fissures of the earth, Morgoth's servants listened and waited. The snare had been laid, though none yet knew it. The years passed quietly, and many came to believe that Morgoth's wrath had turned elsewhere. Yet Idril's heart remained uneasy, and one night she said to Tuor, "Evil moves beneath our feet. I know it, though I cannot prove it. We must make ready a path of escape, should the darkness ever find us." Tuor looked upon her with sorrow, but he did not gainsay her. Together they began their secret labor. Quietly, in hidden chambers, they planned a way that led beneath the city and out toward the mountains, a narrow path through which, if doom came, the people of Gondolin might flee. Thus hope and treachery grew side by side, unseen by one another, while Morgoth's hatred deepened like a gathering storm, and in the night the mountains shuddered, as if the world itself foresaw what was to come. Spring returned to Tumladen, and Gondolin shone once more beneath the sun. The white towers gleamed, the fountains sang, and banners of silver and green fluttered over the walls. To the eyes of its people, the city seemed eternal, untouched by time or shadow. Yet beneath that fair surface, the slow workings of fate moved unseen, patient as roots growing in stone. Meglin's forge burned hotter than ever in those days. He had grown silent and withdrawn, but none could deny the marvels that came from his hands. Blades of perfect balance, armor light as air and hard as diamond, ornaments that glowed with an inner fire. These he wrought with skill unmatched. The king praised him often, and the people honored his craft. Yet Meglin found no joy in their praise. His eyes followed Idril wherever she went, and bitterness darkened his spirit like smoke within a clear vessel. Only Idril herself sensed the danger that grew in the city's heart. Though she spoke little of it, her dreams were troubled. In them she saw fire upon the mountains, towers falling, and a shadow vast and winged blotting out the stars. Each morning she awoke beside Tor, with tears upon her face. Tor comforted her, but he too had seen omens. The streams of the valley ran lower than before, and the winds from the north carried the faint scent of smoke. The eagles that once circled high above the peaks were seldom seen. Then, one bright morning, a company of hunters came to the king's hall. They had been ranging near the northern heights, where the cliffs rise sharp as spears against the sky. There, they said, they had found strange signs, tracks of heavy boots where none should be, and marks upon the stones, as of claws. The court murmured in unease, but Meglin only smiled faintly. "Wolves, perhaps," he said, "or mountain cats driven down by hunger." Tuor's gaze met his, calm and steady. "No beast leaves such marks, Lord Meglin. The enemy's servants may have found a way into the mountains." "Impossible," Meglin replied swiftly. "No road leads here save the one we guard, and none could find it unbidden." But Turgon, hearing the hunter's tale, grew grave. He ordered new watchtowers raised upon the high ridges, and the sentries doubled at each gate. Messengers were sent to the king's captains, and for a time Gondolin stirred with quiet preparation. Yet still the people sang, for they trusted in their hidden strength. That very night, Meglin rode alone from the northern gate, saying he sought new veins of ore for the city's forges. None dared question him, for he was of the royal house and beloved by the king. He took with him only one servant, a silent and grim elf of his household, and passed out through the 7 gates beneath the watch of the guards. But he did not return to his mines. For 3 days he rode northward, deeper into the barren lands between the encircling mountains and the waste beyond. The snow lay deep there, and the wind howled through the peaks. On the 4th night, as he camped beneath a cliff of black stone, the storm came. Lightning split the sky, and in its glare he saw them, shapes moving upon the heights, dark and vast, their eyes red as coals. Orcs, wolves, and worse things gathered there, their numbers uncounted. And behind them, upon a ridge of fire-lit stone, stood a figure taller than any man or elf, wrapped in black armor that seemed to drink the light. Meglin fell to his knees. He knew that power, though he had never seen it before. Morgoth had found him. "Son of Eel," the Dark Lord said, and his voice rolled across the snow like thunder. "You have come far from your shining city." Meglin could not speak. His tongue clove to his mouth, and his heart trembled with fear. "I know your mind," Morgoth continued. "You hate the man who has taken what you desire. You despise your kin who look upon you with pity, not honor. And yet they praise you for your craft, even as they forget your name." Meglin shuddered, for each word struck true. "What would you give," said Morgoth softly, "to rule where now you serve? To see the proud city of your uncle fall, and to take for yourself the one whom you love?" Meglin bowed his head, torn between terror and desire. "I would give much, but Gondolin is hidden. Even you cannot find it." Morgoth laughed, and the sound was like the breaking of mountains. "I have sought it long, and you shall show me the way. In return, I will give you the throne of Turgon and the hand of Idril. None shall stand against you." For a long time, Meglin was silent. Snow fell thick about him, hissing as it touched the fire that burned from Morgoth's armor. Then, slowly, he raised his eyes. "If I betray the city, will you spare me?" "I keep my word," said Morgoth, and in his black helm the red light flared. "Lead me to the gates of Gondolin, and when the city falls, I will make you lord over its ashes." Thus Meglin's doom was sealed. He revealed all he knew, the secret of the hidden way, the watch at the 7 gates, the paths through the mountains. And when Morgoth's servants took him, they did not slay him, but sent him back by hidden ways, so that none in Gondolin would suspect what he had done. He returned pale and weary, saying that an avalanche had trapped him for many days. The king rejoiced at his coming and asked no questions, for Turgon loved him still. Only Idril looked upon him with unease, for there was a shadow in his eyes that had not been there before. From that day onward, Meglin walked the streets of Gondolin as one haunted. He labored in his forges and spoke softly to the king of the strength of their walls, urging him to raise new defenses. "Let us build great engines of war," he said, "lest the enemy come upon us unawares." Turgon listened, troubled. "We are hidden still," he answered. "No foe has found our gates." But Idril, hearing this counsel, grew fearful. That night she came to Tuor and said, "The walls will not save us. I feel in my heart that our doom draws near. We must complete the secret way, for soon we shall need it." Tuor agreed, and in deep secrecy their work continued. By night they toiled in the caverns beneath the king's tower, hollowing passages through stone, leading out to the vale beyond the mountains. Few knew of it, save for those they trusted most, and the labor was long. Meanwhile, In the dark plains beyond the encircling mountains, Morgoth's armies gathered. Dragons that had slept for centuries stirred once more in their lairs, and the Balrogs kindled their whips of flame. Orcs and wolves filled the valleys, and the very earth trembled beneath their tread. For 7 years the Dark Lord prepared, forging weapons and summoning his hosts. Then, when the signs were right, and the stars shone cold and dim, he loosed his wrath. A fire lit the northern sky, red as dawn, and smoke rose above the mountains. The watchers upon Gondolin's walls saw it and cried out, but no one yet knew what doom approached. Far away, in the deep chambers of his palace, Turgon dreamed of thunder and flame. He awoke with a cry, and the bells of Gondolin began to toll once more, for the storm of Morgoth had at last begun to move. The dawn that broke upon Gondolin was strange and cruel. The air, once so clear and sweet, lay heavy with the scent of smoke. Over the eastern peaks, the sun rose blood-red, dimmed by a haze that stretched far beyond sight. From the highest towers, the watchers cried that the northern sky burned like a forge, and a murmur of unease spread through the city. Turgon stood upon the balcony of his tower, gazing northward. His heart was troubled, for the light that flickered upon the horizon was no common fire. "This is the work of Morgoth," he said at last, his voice low. "His wrath moves again, though I know not where it will fall." Beside him stood Tuor, clad in silver mail. "My lord," he said, "we must not wait. Ulmo warned that the safety of Gondolin would not endure forever. The time may be near when we must flee." But Turgon's pride was deep-rooted, and his faith in the secrecy of his city still unshaken. "Flee. From stone and fire I will not run," he answered. "Gondolin has stood against all the powers of the north. Let Morgoth come. He shall find here a wall he cannot break." Tuor bowed, though sorrow shadowed his eyes. He said no more, for he knew that counsel could not move the king. Yet Idril, standing behind them, wept silently, for she felt the tremor of doom that quivered through the very stones. In the days that followed, strange tidings reached the gates. Messengers sent to watch the northern passes didn't return. Distant tremors shook the mountains, and from the hidden streams there rose a faint warmth, as though the fires of the world stirred beneath their roots. The skies were filled with cloud and ash, and the light of day waned to a dull gloom. Then one night, without warning, a terrible sound rolled through the mountains, a deep, thunderous roar that seemed to come from every side. The people woke in fear, and the bells were rung from every tower. From the northern heights came a glow like molten metal, and the air itself began to tremble. Ecthelion, captain of the fountain, rode through the streets, calling his men to arms. His armor shone like quicksilver, and his horn sounded high and clear above the tumult. "To the gates!" he cried. "All to their houses and ranks! The enemy is upon us!" At that moment, the watchers at the sixth gate saw fire burst from the mountain peaks, and streams of molten rock poured down into the vale beyond. Dragons had come, great serpents of flame and iron, crawling through the ravines, melting stone as they went. Behind them marched countless hosts of orcs and balrogs, and the shadow of Morgoth's wrath darkened the land. From the north they came in 3 great columns, their banners black against the firelit sky. The first struck the outer sentries and swept them away like leaves in storm. The second turned eastward, scaling cliffs that had never before felt the tread of foes. The third advanced toward the secret valley, guided by the treacherous knowledge of Meglin. High above, the eagles of Thorondor wheeled and cried in anguish, for even their mighty wings could not stem that tide of ruin. They stooped upon the dragon hosts, tearing at eyes and throats, but fire met them, and many fell blazing into the abyss. In Gondolin the alarm rose like a wave. The gates were shut, the walls manned, and every street echoed with the sound of running feet and clashing arms. The lords of the 12 houses gathered their banners, the hammer of wrath, the golden flower, the fountain, the tree, and took their posts. Women and children were led to the inner squares beneath the towers, while the warriors arrayed themselves before the gates. Tuor came to Idril, and their young son Eärendil. "Go now to the secret way," he said. "If the worst should come, you must lead our people forth." Idril's eyes filled with tears. "And you?" "I will hold the gates as long as I may," Tuor answered. "If Gondolin must fall, it shall not fall unavenged." Then he kissed her brow and went forth into the smoke. At the northernmost gate, the first assault fell. The walls shook as the dragons hurled themselves against the stone, their fiery breath searing the battlements. Ecthelion and his men fought valiantly, casting down orcs with spears and arrows. But the heat grew unbearable, and soon the gate itself began to melt. When at last the iron doors burst inward, the hosts of Morgoth poured through. The streets filled with battle, elves and orcs locked in deadly struggle, their cries echoing through the marble halls. Turgon himself took up arms, his white standard shining amid the smoke. "To me, Gondolindrim!" he shouted, and his voice rang clear as a trumpet. "For the house of Fingolfin, and the light of the west!" For a time the defenders held. In the square of the king, Ecthelion of the Fountain met Gothmog, lord of Balrogs. Their duel was terrible to see, fire and water clashing in deadly fury. 3 times Ecthelion was beaten to his knees, but he rose each time, his blade flashing like starlight. At last, when his sword was broken, he leapt forward and drove the spike of his helm into the Balrog's breast. Gothmog fell, dragging Ecthelion with him into the fountain, and both were lost beneath its boiling waters. Elsewhere, Tuor led the House of the Wing against the northern breach. He fought beside Rodg of the Hammer of Wrath, and together they slew many foes. But the dragons pressed on, and the fire spread from street to street. The marble walls cracked, towers crumbled, and the very air turned to smoke. Amid the chaos, Meglin sought out Idril. He found her near the king's square, guarding the secret passage she and Tuor had built. Mad with desire and despair, he seized her and tried to drag her away. But Tuor came upon them, and they fought upon the high walls. Meglin's blade struck Tuor's shoulder, yet the mortal man, filled with wrath, cast him over the battlements. Meglin fell screaming into the fire below, and so ended the traitor of Gondolin. By then the city was lost. The king, seeing that all hope had perished, stood upon the steps of his tower and looked once more upon the city he had built. "Great was my pride," he said softly, "but greater still is my sorrow. May the Valar forgive me." Then the tower of Turgon trembled and fell, burying him beneath its ruin. Tuor gathered what remained of the people, Idril, Eärendil, and those few who could still fight, and led them to the secret way. Through the smoke-filled streets they passed, flames leaping around them, while behind, the last defenders made their final stand. When they reached the hidden tunnel, Idril turned for one last glance. Gondolin burned. Its towers were pillars of fire, its streets rivers of molten stone. The laughter and music of ages were silenced, and the white city of the hidden valley was no more. Yet though Morgoth's hatred had triumphed, his victory was not complete. For through that narrow passage, hope yet lived, born in the arms of Tuor and Idril, and in the bright eyes of their child, Eärendil, who would one day bring the light of the morning star to a world drowned in shadow. And far away, in the dark fortress of Angband, Morgoth sat upon his throne and smiled. A smile cold as iron, cruel as death. He believed his vengeance fulfilled. But the doom he had sown that day would, in ages yet to come, bring about his own ruin. Through smoke and ruin they fled, the remnant of the fair city that had once been Gondolin. The secret tunnel, hewn long ago by Idril's foresight, opened beneath the king's square and led downward through the mountain's roots. There the air was stifling, thick with dust and the scent of fire, but still they pressed on, Tuor leading with a torch in hand, Idril close behind, bearing their son Eärendil, wrapped in a grey cloak. Behind them came a train of survivors, men and women of the 12 houses, wounded and weary, yet steadfast in their hearts. Among them were Goldor of the Tree, Egalmoth of the Heavenly Arch, and a handful of Ecthilion's guards, their bright helms dulled with ash. No songs they sang, for grief choked their throats. The only sound was the drip of water and the faint rumble of thunder above, where Gondolin was dying. At times the passage narrowed, and they were forced to move in single file, their footsteps echoing against the damp walls. Once, the ground shook beneath them, and dust rained from the ceiling. A woman cried out, fearing the mountain would fall, but Tuor raised his torch and spoke calmly. "Fear not. Ulmo's hand has not forsaken us. Go on, and swiftly." After many hours they came at last to the mouth of the tunnel, hidden among the rocks of a deep ravine on the western side of the mountains. The air there was cool and thin, and above them the stars shone faint through veils of smoke, but the sight that met their eyes struck them with dread. Behind, in the valley of Tumladen, the world was aflame. Gondolin burned like a crown of fire beneath the mountains. Its white towers toppled, its walls shattered. Red rivers of molten rock flowed through the streets, and above the ruin loomed the shapes of dragons, vast and terrible, their wings blotting out the stars. The cries of the dying reached even to that hidden cleft, carried on the wind like the wailing of lost souls. Many fell to their knees, weeping. Idril covered her face, and Tuor stood silent, his hand upon the hilt of his sword. "Thus perishes the fairest city of the elves," he said softly. "But from its ashes, hope shall yet arise." They turned then to their long journey westward, seeking the land of Sirion, where the exiles of the Noldor yet dwelt. The way was perilous, for Morgoth's hosts still prowled the mountains, hunting the fugitives. More than once they saw the gleam of eyes in the dark, and heard the tramp of orcish feet upon the stones. It was on the second night that they were first attacked. As they crossed a narrow ledge above a deep gorge, a band of orcs fell upon their rear, hurling spears and stones. Goldor's men held the line, while Tuor led Idril and the others to safety. The battle was fierce and brief. Many fell on both sides, and the gorge echoed with the clash of steel and the cries of the wounded. In the end, Tuor drove the last of the orcs into the abyss, but the cost was heavy. When they counted their company, they found that half their number were gone. Egalmoth spoke then, weary and sorrowful. "We cannot continue thus. Each day we are hunted, each night we lose more to shadow. We must find refuge, or none of us will see the morning." But Idril said, "There is no refuge save the sea. For there Ulmo's power still dwells. To Sirion we must go, though all the mountains rise against us." So they pressed on. Through dark ravines and over broken cliffs they passed, guided by Tuor's strength and Idril's wisdom. The days were long and cruel. Food was scarce, and many went hungry. Still they marched, their spirits sustained by the hope that somewhere beyond the mountains lay freedom. At times they found traces of other survivors, footprints in the ash, or a broken sword cast aside. but seldom any living soul. Once they came upon a ruined camp where the bodies of elves lay strewn among the rocks, their faces pale in the moonlight. Idril knelt beside them and wept, but Tuor said, "Do not despair. Their valor bought us this chance. We must not let their sacrifice be in vain." On the 7th night they reached a high pass from which they could look down upon the western lands. Far below, the plains of Beleriand stretched wide beneath the stars, and beyond them shimmered the faint glimmer of the sea. For the first time since the fall of the city, hope stirred among them. Yet their peril was not ended. For as they descended the pass, a shadow fell across the moon, and a sound like the beating of vast wings filled the air. The mountains trembled, and from the darkness above came a cry that froze their blood. "Balrog!" someone shouted. Out of the gloom it came, a creature of flame and shadow, greater even than the one Glorfindel had slain years before. Its whip lashed through the night, and fire streamed from its mane. The rocks beneath its feet glowed red with heat. Panic seized the company, but Tuor stood firm. "To me, all who can fight," he cried. "Hold the path while the others flee." The warriors gathered around him, forming a ring of steel. The women and children fled down the slope, Idril leading them, her heart breaking at the sound of battle behind her. The fight was desperate. The Balrog's fire scorched the air, and its blows shattered stone. Many brave warriors fell before its fury. Tuor's shield was blackened and cracked, his sword melted at the edge, yet still he fought on. Then, as hope waned, a clear cry rang through the darkness, the voice of Thorondor, Lord of Eagles. Down from the high peaks he came with his kin, vast and terrible, and they fell upon the Balrog with beak and talon. The creature roared, striking at them with its flaming whip, but the eagles were swift, and in their fury they drove it to the brink of the abyss. There, upon a narrow ledge, the Balrog made its last stand. Tuor, seizing the moment, thrust his spear deep into its side. The beast staggered, shrieking, and the rocks gave way beneath it. With a cry that echoed through the mountains, it fell, and the fire of its body vanished into the depths below. When silence returned, the eagles circled overhead, their wings glinting in the firelight. Thorondor spoke to Tuor in the tongue of the Valar, saying, "Well, have you fought, son of men? Take now your people, and go swiftly. The enemy's wrath is not yet spent, and his servants will soon return." Tuor bowed his head in gratitude. "You have saved us in our darkest hour. May your name be blessed while the stars endure." Then the eagles departed, and the survivors gathered once more. They buried their dead beneath the stones, and in the morning light they resumed their journey, hearts heavy, yet unbroken. Days later, they came at last to the green meadows of the Vale of Sirion, where the river flowed broad and bright to the western sea. There they were welcomed by the elves who dwelt by the shore, and for the first time since the fall of Gondolin, they found rest. Tuor stood upon the cliffs and looked westward, where the sea met the sky. Idril came beside him, and their son Erendil laughed in her arms, reaching toward the light. "Here ends our flight," Tuor said softly, "but perhaps not our purpose." For in that moment, as the wind from the sea touched their faces, both felt a stirring in their hearts, a whisper of fate yet unfulfilled, and of a hope that one day would rise from the ruins of the hidden city to bring light even to the darkest depths of the world. The days passed slowly in the green vale of Sirion. The survivors of Gondolin, weary and broken, began to build new homes along the banks of the great river, far from the smoldering wreck of their lost city. There the grass grew tall and sweet, and the sea winds carried the scent of salt and freedom. The land was fair, and for a time it seemed peace might dwell again among them. Tuor labored beside his people, raising shelters of wood and stone, while Idril tended to the wounded and comforted those who still wept for kin left behind in the fire. Though grief lay heavy upon them all, the strength of their hearts endured. They named the place the Havens of Sirion, for from there the waters flowed westward to the Sea of Belegire, and it was said that the music of Ulmo himself could be heard in the sighing of the tides. Yet not all hearts were at rest. Tuor would often walk alone by the cliffs, looking out over the sea. The waves broke upon the rocks below, glittering in the sunlight, and their rhythm spoke to him as no words could. There was power in that vast expanse, a promise that stirred his soul. Idril watched him from afar, her heart full of both love and fear, for she knew that the call of Ulmo, the Lord of Waters, still echoed in her husband's spirit. In those years, Erendil grew swiftly. The boy had his mother's grace and his father's courage, and in his bright eyes shone the light of both elves and men. He loved the sea most of all, and would spend long hours along the shore, gathering shells and speaking with the mariners who came down from the north. Often he would ask his father about the white towers of Gondolin, and Tuor would tell him of its fountains and high walls, though sorrow touched his voice each time he spoke its name. One evening, as the sun sank red over the waves, Tuor stood upon a high promontory with Erendil beside him. The wind whipped through their hair, and the sea roared below. "Father," said Erendil, "why do you look always to the west? What lies beyond the edge of the sea?" Tuor smiled faintly. "Beyond lies the land of the Valar, where no mortal foot may tread. There dwell the powers who shaped the world, and among them Ulmo, who once guided me to your mother. It is said that beyond the world's rim there is peace, unbroken by shadow." "Will we ever go there?" the boy asked. "Perhaps," Tuor said softly, "if the sea should one day call us." The wind sighed, and for a long moment neither spoke, but Idril, who had followed them unseen, turned away with a heavy heart, for she knew that the sea's call was no idle thing. It was a summons that none who heard it could long resist. As the years went by, more exiles came to the havens, elves who had escaped from the north, men fleeing from Morgoth's wrath, and even a few of the Falathrim, the sea elves of Círdan. They brought with them tidings of war and ruin. Morgoth's power now covered all Beleriand. Only a few hidden refuges still stood against him. The sons of Feanor, driven by their unending oath, fought bitterly in the east, and their strife brought sorrow to friend and foe alike. But in Sirion, hope yet lingered. Under Tuor's guidance, the refugees built ships and learned again the art of the sea. Círdan's mariners came to teach them, and soon white sails dotted the waters like wings of swans. They fished the deep waters and traded with the remaining havens of the coast. Erendil took to the sea as though born to it. By the time he reached his manhood, he was already the finest mariner among them, brave and tireless. His ship, Vingilot, gleamed with silver and pearl, its prow shaped like a swan's head. Often he would sail far out, beyond sight of land, seeking news of the world and perhaps a glimpse of the light that once had shone from Valinor. But still the shadow in the north grew darker. At times the sea itself seemed to brood, and strange fires were seen far off beyond the horizon. Rumors came that Morgoth's creatures now prowled even the western coasts, and many feared that nowhere in Middle-earth was safe from his malice. Then came the day when Tuor could no longer ignore the sea's call. It came to him in dreams, the sound of deep waters and the voice of Ulmo speaking from the deeps. "Your task is not ended, son of Hor," the voice said. The doom of the Noldor draws near its end, and from your line shall come the hope of elves and men. Go now to the west, before the final darkness falls. When Tuor awoke, the sea lay calm beneath the dawn, but he knew what he must do. He went to Idril and took her hands in his. My love, the sea calls me. Ulmo has spoken. We must sail westward, beyond the sight of these shores. Idril's eyes filled with tears. Then our parting is near. I have long feared this hour. Yet if it is the will of the Valar, I will not hold you back. Together they made ready a ship, white and strong, and gathered provisions for their voyage. Erendil stood upon the quay and watched in silence, for though he longed to go, his heart told him that his own path lay elsewhere. When all was prepared, Tuor and Idril embraced their son. Remember who you are, Tuor said. You are of both worlds, elf and man, and in you lies the hope of all who yet resist the shadow. Then, as the tide turned, the ship slipped its moorings and sailed out into the west. The wind filled its sails, and its prow rose upon the waves like a bird taking flight. For many days those who dwelt by Sirion watched it vanish into the sunset, until at last it was seen no more. Some say Tuor and Idril came indeed to the Undying Lands and were granted a place among the Eldar, the only mortal man to dwell there beyond the world's end. Others say they were swallowed by the sea and became part of its eternal music. None can say for certain, for they were never seen again in Middle-earth. Erendil remained in the Havens, and in time he wedded Elwing, the daughter of Dior of Doriath, who bore in her keeping the Silmaril that Beren and Luthien had won from Morgoth's crown. Great love grew between them, and their people rejoiced, for in their union the lines of all the noble houses of the elves and men were joined. Yet their joy was not long to last. The sons of Feanor, still bound by their terrible oath, learned that the Silmaril was hidden in the havens of Sirion. And when Morgoth's darkness was deepest, it was not his orcs who first brought ruin there, but the swords of their own kin. Thus the tale that had begun in light drew once more toward shadow. For though Morgoth had fallen silent for a time, his hatred still worked through envy and pride. The doom of the Noldor had not yet run its full course, and the hope born from Gondolin's ashes would soon be tested in blood and fire once more. And so the waves rolled on beneath the fading stars, bearing secrets westward, while in the east the black wind stirred again, whispering the name of Morgoth across the sleeping lands. In the years that followed Tuor's sailing, peace lingered faintly upon the havens of Sirion. Yet it was not the peace of joy, but of weariness, as the calm that comes after storm when the land lies broken and waiting. The survivors of Gondolin and Doriath, though diminished, built fair dwellings by the shore, white-walled and crowned with banners that fluttered in the sea wind. Ships of silver and grey plied the waters, bringing fish and pearls, and children's laughter once more echoed across the dunes. Erendil dwelt among them as lord, though he was still young in years. His heart, like his father's before him, was drawn ever to the sea. Each dawn he would stand upon the high cliffs, watching the light break upon the waves, and at evening he would walk the strand with Elwing beside him, her hair dark as the wings of a swallow. Elwing bore in her keeping the Silmaril that Beren and Luthien had wrested from Morgoth's crown, an heirloom of doom and beauty. It shone softly even in darkness, casting pale fire upon her hands, and the folk of Sirion revered it as a blessing, for its light brought them hope in the shadowed world. Yet others feared it, remembering the curse that followed all who possessed the jewels of Feanor. But Erendil loved the Silmaril for the light that reminded him of the stars. for he dreamed often of reaching Valinor and pleading before the Valar for mercy upon Middle-earth. He would spend long nights speaking with the mariners and shipwrights, planning vessels strong enough to brave the outer seas. Somewhere beyond that horizon, he would say, pointing west, lies the land of the powers. If I can but find the way, perhaps I may win pardon for elves and men alike, and bring healing to this world of tears. Elwing would smile sadly. You seek what none has ever found, my lord. Yet if any heart could move the sea itself, it would be yours. Still, a shadow gathered beyond their joy. In the north, Morgoth brooded in his dark fortress, though he stirred little now, for his triumph seemed complete. His will lay heavy upon Beleriand. Rivers ran sluggish, and the stars themselves seemed dimmer. Yet worse than his silence was the unrest among the sons of Feanor, who had not forgotten their father's oath. News came that Medros and Maglor, the last of the 7 brothers, had learned that the Silmaril was kept at the Havens. Though years of war had wearied them, and the blood of kindred weighed heavy upon their souls, the oath burned still in their hearts, like a brand that would not cool. Thus they gathered what followers remained to them, and sent messengers to Cirion, demanding that Elwing yield the jewel, for by right of Feanor they claimed it. When the messengers came, weary and dust-covered, they were brought before Eärendil and Elwing in the great hall of white stone. The Silmaril gleamed upon the dais, casting light upon their faces. The leader of the messengers spoke. By the oath of Feanor, sworn before Eru himself, we claim the Silmaril that is ours by right. Surrender it, and we shall leave you in peace. Eärendil's face hardened. The Silmaril was not won by craft or claim, but by the blood and valor of Beren and Luthien, who dared the very halls of Morgoth. It is not yours nor mine, but a gift to all who fight the shadow. The messenger's eyes darkened. Then you bring doom upon yourselves. The sons of Feanor will not rest until they have what was sworn to them. So saying, they departed, and heavy silence fell upon the hall. That night, Eärendil stood again by the sea, his thoughts troubled. If I remain, he said to Elwing, our people will perish when they come for the jewel. Yet if I go, perhaps I can reach Valinor and bring aid before it is too late. Elwing took his hands in hers. Then go, beloved. Follow your heart and the call of Ulmo. I will guard the Silmaril and our people until you return. Thus at dawn, Eärendil set sail upon Vingilot, his shining ship, with a small crew of elves and men who trusted him beyond fear. The white sails filled with wind, and soon the vessel vanished into the mists of the western sea. Long and perilous was his voyage. Storms beat upon the ship, and waves rose higher than mountains. Many times they thought they would be swallowed by the deep, but always the sea seemed to spare them, as though a hidden hand guided their course. They saw strange lands, where the air shimmered with light and shadow mingled, and flocks of seabirds that no mariner had known before. But as Eärendil sought the path to the undying lands, doom fell upon the havens. For the sons of Feanor came at last, not in friendship, but with sword and fire. They descended upon the people of Cirion in the grey light of dawn, and once more the blood of elf was spilled by elf. The sea turned red that day, and the cries of the slain echoed across the waves. Elwing fled with the Silmaril, pursued to the very edge of the cliffs. Surrounded, she looked down upon the crashing surf and saw no escape. Then, lifting the jewel high above her head, she cried, "By this light shall hope not perish!" and leapt into the sea. The waves took her, and her enemies saw her no more. Some say the waters rose to catch her, and that Ulmo bore her away, changing her into the shape of a white bird. Others tell that she drowned, and the sea claimed both her body and the Silmaril. But whatever the truth, when night fell, a white bird with silver wings came to Erendil's ship, bearing upon its breast the shining jewel. Erendil took the bird gently in his hands, and as he touched it, Elwing stood before him once more, living and radiant. Great was their joy and sorrow mingled, and he knew that their paths were now bound together beyond all parting. Guided by the light of the Silmaril, Vingilot sailed on. The seas grew strange, and the air shimmered with a brilliance that was neither of sun nor moon. At last they came to the borders of the world, where the waters curved beneath the stars and the straight road began. No mortal ship had ever passed beyond that point, but the power of the Silmaril opened the way. Erendil's mariners trembled, for they knew they set foot upon paths forbidden to the living. Yet Erendil's heart was steadfast, and he steered his ship into the light of the west. Thus he came at last to the shores of Aman, the blessed realm. There he set foot upon the land of the Valar, and stood before the gates of Valmar, though no mortal before him had done so. And he cried out, "O lords of the west, hear me. For the sake of both elves and men, I beg you, pardon us, and lift from the world the shadow of Morgoth." His voice echoed through the shining streets, and the Valar heard his plea. Manwë, king of the air, spoke then with compassion, and the hosts of the west were stirred. So began the last great war, the War of Wrath, when the Valar rose against Morgoth, and their armies came forth across the sea. But that tale belongs to another age, and though Erendil would never again set foot upon mortal shores, his name was written among the stars. For his ship was set in the heavens, and the Silmaril upon his brow became the morning star, a sign of hope that even in the darkest night, light endures. And in the deep chambers of the void, Morgoth heard that light and trembled, for the hatred he had sown had turned at last to his undoing. Far beyond the mortal shores of Middle-earth, where the sea meets the rim of the world, Erendil stood before the powers of the west. The land of Aemon shone with a light unlike that of any sunrise, for there the radiance of the two trees yet lingered, a memory preserved in the airs of Valinor. His ship, Vingilot, lay at anchor in a bay of crystal waters, its sails still filled with the winds of fate. Upon its prow burned the Silmaril, and its light bathed the shore in a glory that even the Valar beheld with wonder. Erendil and Elwing stood together upon the marble strand, weary from their long voyage, yet fearless before the thrones of the powers. Before them rose the mountain of Tanicatil, where Manwë Sulimo sat enthroned, his countenance bright as the morning sky. Beside him was Varda, Lady of the Stars, whose eyes held the first light ever kindled. Around them gathered the Valar, Ulmo of the deeps, Yavanna the giver of fruits, Nienna the mourner, and Mandos the doomsman of the Valar, whose gaze pierced all hearts. Erendil bowed low, his voice ringing clear across the silent court. "Lords of the West, we come not in pride, but in need. The world you shaped is in bondage. Morgoth Bauglair, your foe of old, still reigns in Angband, and all the lands of Middle-earth are wrapped in darkness. The elves are scattered, the men enslaved, and the light you gave us fades. I, Erendil, beg you, bring deliverance to those who yet fight for freedom." Long was the silence that followed. The Valar looked one to another, and the air trembled with their thought. At last Manwë spoke, his voice deep as thunder upon the peaks. "Your words are bold, child of both kindreds, yet no mortal has ever stood upon these shores since the world was made. By what right do you come hither?" Then Elwing stepped forward, holding high the Silmaril, whose light filled the hall like the glow of lost laurelin. "By this light," she said, "one through love and death, we claim the right to plead for mercy. For though Morgoth holds the world in shadow, still the flame of the valor burns within this jewel. Shall that light be quenched forever?" At her words, a murmur passed among the Valar, and many bowed their heads. For the Silmaril, that had caused so much strife and sorrow, now shone as a token of hope unlooked for. Ulmo rose then, his voice like the breaking of waves. "I spoke long ago on behalf of this man, Tuor's son. His coming was foretold, and in him the doom of the Noldor shall find its healing. Let us not deny what Eru has willed." Mandos said only, "So it was decreed." And Varda, smiling faintly, lifted her hand. "Let the light of this Silmaril be set among the stars, a beacon to all who wander in darkness until the end of days." So judgment was given. Eärendil and Elving were granted immortality, for though he was born of men, his heart was of the Eldar, and the Valar would not sunder them. Yet they were not permitted to return to Middle-earth, for their task in the world of flesh was ended. Instead, Eärendil was appointed to sail the heavens, bearing the Silmaril upon his brow, that its light might shine as the morning and evening star. Thus Vingilot was hallowed, and Eärendil ascended into the sky. Often he passed above the world, his ship a bright spark amid the night. To the weary and the lost, he became a sign of hope, and many who saw his light named him Gil-Estel, the star of high hope. But when the Valar heard of the ruin wrought in Middle-earth, the slaying at the havens of Sirion, the burning of lands, and the despair of both elves and men, they could no longer remain at peace. Then Manwë called forth all the hosts of Valinor to war. Never since the beginning of the world had such an army been seen. The Vanyar, fairest of the elves, came forth under Ingwe, their high king. The remnants of the Noldor who had never rebelled took up their arms, and even the Maiar went with them, shining spirits clad in battle form. Their banners were white and gold, their swords bright as flame. From the western sea they sailed in ships that glided without oar or sail, driven by the breath of Manwë. They came to the shores of Beleriand, like a storm at sunrise. The trumpets of the Valar sounded, and the mountains trembled. Morgoth's servants fled before the light that returned to the world. Thus began the War of Wrath, the greatest battle ever fought upon Middle-earth. The armies of Angband poured forth from the north, Balrogs, dragons, and countless orcs, but against the might of the west they could not prevail. The hosts of the Valar swept through the lands like a cleansing fire. Mountains were rent asunder, rivers changed their courses, and the very earth groaned beneath their struggle. Eärendil himself fought from the sky, for Vingilot descended upon the airs above Angband, and he battled Ancalagon the Black, mightiest of all the winged dragons. Long they strove, fire against flame, until at last Eärendil cast down his foe. Ancalagon fell upon the towers of Thangorodrim, and their ruin shook the world. Seeing his might undone, Morgoth quailed in his deep halls. The Valar broke the gates of Angband, and there they found him sitting upon his throne of iron. He rose in wrath, but his power was spent, and he could not stand before the light of the Valar. They bound him with the chain Angenor, the same that had once held him in the beginning of days, and he was cast into the void beyond the world, where he remains until the end of time. Thus the First Age came to its end, and the shadow of Morgoth was lifted from the earth. Yet the victory was bitter, for Beleriand was broken and drowned. The sea swept in, where mountains once had stood, and the fair lands of the elves sank beneath the waves. Few of the ancient realms survived. The Isle of Bala, the mouth of Sirion, and a handful of high places that rose above the flood. The elves who had endured were summoned to return to the west, and many obeyed, weary of grief. Others chose to remain, and from them would descend the elves of later ages. As for the men who had fought beside the Valar, they were given a new land far to the west, a gift for their loyalty, a land that would one day be called Númenor. And though the world was remade, the light of Eärendil still shone each night above the seas. The mariners of Númenor would often see it glimmering over the western horizon, and knew it to be a sign that the Valar watched still from afar. So ended the long tale that had begun in Gondolin's secret halls and in the pride of Morgoth's heart. From hatred and ruin came at last hope and healing, though the scars of that war would never wholly fade. And high above the mists of the world, the star of high hope sailed on, bright and unwavering, a reminder that even in the darkest hour, when towers fall and kingdoms burn, the flame of light and love may yet endure against the shadow. And in the deep night, when the seas are calm and the wind lies sleeping, the mariners of later days say they can still hear faint music drifting from the west, a song of Eärendil and Elwing echoing across the waters, a song of grief and glory, of worlds lost and worlds reborn. The world after the War of Wrath was not the world that had been before. Beleriand, the ancient realm of the Noldor, lay beneath the sea, its forests drowned, its mountains shattered, its rivers gone to silence. Only a few highlands remained above the waves, lonely isles where once the great kingdoms had stood. The lands that endured were strange and new, shaped by the hands of the Valar when they remade the world to heal its wounds. Far to the west lay Númenor, the star-shaped isle, a gift from the Valar to the Edain, who had fought against Morgoth. There the sea was clear and the air pure, and the people who dwelt there were greater in stature and longer lived than any race of men before or since. They called themselves the Dúnedain, the men of the west, and their first king was Elros, brother of Elrond, and son of Eärendil the Blessed. From his father he inherited the choice between the kindreds of elves and men, and Elros chose the latter, for he loved the world of sunlight and the works of mortal hands. Yet long was his life, and his wisdom deep, and his people prospered under his rule. They built tall cities of white stone upon the shores and harbors that shone with lanterns by night. Ships of silver sailed forth upon the sea, and their banners bore the emblem of the Star of Eärendil, whose light they honored above all things. Each evening, the mariners of Númenor would stand upon the western cliffs and watch the star rise over the ocean, gleaming like a diamond above the shadowed rim of the world. It was said that Eärendil himself guided their voyages, and that the blessing of the Valar followed those who sailed in his light. In those early ages, the Dúnedain were humble and wise. They cherished the friendship of the elves who yet lingered in Middle-earth, and often the ships of Númenor came to the Grey Havens, where Círdan the shipwright still kept watch. From him they learned many crafts and tales of the elder days. The Valar forbade them to sail west beyond sight of their home, but the east lay open to them, and there they journeyed often, bringing knowledge and healing to the lesser men who had dwelt long in darkness under Morgoth's shadow. Thus for many generations peace endured, and Númenor became the fairest realm of men. Its fields were green, its mountains crowned with snow, and its people tall, noble, and wise. In Armenelos, the city of kings, the towers shone like silver in the sun, and in the courts of their palace grew trees brought from Eldamar itself, descendants of Telperion, the white tree of the blessed realm. But as the centuries passed and the memory of war faded, pride began to grow in the hearts of the Dunedain. For their lives were long and their might great, and they began to envy the immortality of the elves. Some whispered that it was unjust that men should die while the firstborn lived on unaging, and though the Valar had granted them long life and great lands, their hearts were not satisfied. It began with murmurs, then with open questioning. Why, they asked, should the ban of the Valar hold us forever from the west? Have we not earned the right to gaze upon the undying lands whose light our fathers beheld? Why should death be our fate, if not some punishment for a sin long past? The wise among them tried to counsel patience, reminding their kin that mortality was not a curse, but a gift, that men were free from the circles of the world and might pass beyond them to a fate unknown, even to the Valar. But few listened. The hearts of men turned increasingly toward the world, clinging to its beauty and fearing its end. In the days of Taratanamir the Proud, the 12th king of Númenor, the first shadow fell. The king and many of his people began to resent the Valar, calling them cruel jailers who kept immortality for themselves. They ceased to send gifts to the west and built great tombs for their dead, seeking by craft and sorcery to delay the coming of age and death. The faithful few, who still honored the friendship of the elves, were scorned and driven into silence. Only in secret did some still look westward and speak the ancient blessings of Eru Ilúvatar. Among them were those descended from Elros's brother, Elrond, who had remained in Middle-earth, and their friendship endured across the seas. Yet even amid pride, the light of Eärendil still shone each night above the western horizon, bright and steadfast. Many of the faithful would climb to the high places of Númenor and lift their eyes to that star, finding in it comfort and remembrance of their forefathers' humility. In the east, meanwhile, the lands of Middle-earth began once more to darken. Though Morgoth was banished beyond the world, his shadow lingered, and from that shadow another power arose. In the ruins of Angband, deep under the earth, a servant of Morgoth stirred, a Maiar named Sauron, who had once been mighty in the service of Aule, but had turned to evil long ago. He had survived the fall of his master, hiding in fear. But as ages passed, and the vigilance of the Valar waned, he returned to his old ways. Gathering to himself orcs, beasts and fallen spirits, he rebuilt the strongholds of darkness in the east. To men he came in a fair guise, calling himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, and he taught them many skills of craft and lore. To the elves of Eregion he came also, speaking of friendship and wisdom, and with their aid he forged the rings of power. Thus the seeds of a new evil were sown, though few yet perceived it. The Númenorians, sailing eastward, found new lands under Sauron's shadow and built mighty fortresses upon the coasts. Some came as teachers and friends, but others as lords and conquerors, for pride and desire for dominion had already begun to gnaw at their hearts. Still, the faithful among them remembered the old ways. In the haven of Andunia, upon the western shores, lived the house of Elendil, noble and steadfast, who kept the ancient friendship with the elves, and still taught their people to look to the light of Eärendil, and to the grace of Eru. They spoke against the growing arrogance of the kings, and urged them to turn away from envy and war. But the pride of Númenor had grown too great. Taratanamir died unwilling, clinging to life until his body failed him utterly, and his spirit departed in bitterness. After him came kings who defied openly the will of the Valar, and though the sea still sang of Ulmo's power, and the winds still whispered of Eärendil, the hearts of men had turned to stone, and yet the Valar did not move against them, for they pitied the children of Ilúvatar, even in their folly. They sent no warning save the quiet gleam of a single star that watched always over the western sea. But that star, once a symbol of hope, now became to many a reminder of the boundaries they could not cross. Thus began the long decline of Númenor, the bright kingdom, born of mercy and courage, now slowly poisoned by fear and pride. And while they quarreled among themselves, far away in the east, Sauron's power grew, his eyes ever turned westward, toward the island whose wealth and beauty might yet serve his vengeance. For in his heart still lived the ancient hatred of his master, Morgoth, against the heirs of Eärendil. And the time was drawing near when that hatred would take shape once more, and the flame of Númenor, kindled from the light of the Star of High Hope, would be tested in a fire more terrible than any it had yet known. The shadow of pride deepened upon Númenor. Though the isle still shone fair beneath the sun, a slow decay had begun within its heart. The kings grew restless and brooding, their minds turned from wisdom to dominion, and the people followed in their ways. Their ships, once sent forth to heal and teach, became fleets of conquest, and the banners of the Dunedain were raised over far shores in the east. Mighty were the havens they built along the coasts of Middle-earth, Umbar, Pelargir, and many others, where their towers gleamed white by day and burned with golden light by night. At first they brought knowledge and craft, and the wild tribes of men bowed before them in awe, calling them gods who came out of the sea. But as years passed, their hearts hardened, and they began to enslave the very people they had once taught. The faithful of Númenor, who still revered the Valar and spoke the ancient tongue of the Eldar, looked upon these deeds with grief. They dwelt chiefly in the western lands about Andunia, far from the pride and glory of Armenelos, and there they kept alive the memory of Eärendil and the friendship with the elves. Their leader was Amandil, lord of Andunia, wise and noble of heart, and his son was Elendil the Tall, in whom the light of the west yet shone undimmed. But the kings of Númenor listened not to such counsel. Tar-Calmachil, the 20th ruler, took up the title Aradunachor in the tongue of men, casting aside the elven speech that had once been beloved. His name meant Lord of the West, and with it he claimed for himself the dominion that belonged only to the Valar. From his reign onward, the king's men, as they called themselves, forbade the use of the elven tongue and persecuted the faithful who still lifted their eyes to the west. In secret, however, the faithful continued their rites. Upon the western shore stood the mountain Meneltarma, the pillar of heaven, where in elder days the kings had gone to offer silent prayers to Eru Ilúvatar. Though the forbidden shadow grew, still once a year a few brave hearts would climb that sacred height in secret and look westward, toward the unseen land of the Valar. There they would lift their voices in the ancient hymn of hope, praying that mercy might yet be found for their people. But mercy seldom comes to those who will not seek it. In the reign of Ar-Pharazôn, last and proudest of the kings, the cup of Númenor's arrogance overflowed. He was strong and golden-haired, mighty in war, and his fleets covered the seas like a storm of white wings. No shore in Middle-earth could withstand his coming, and his name was feared even by the servants of Shadow. Yet his heart was restless, for the fear of death burned in him more fiercely than in any before. It was then that Sauron, who had long watched the rise of Númenor, put forth his craft. From his fortress in Mordor he had spread darkness and deceit among the lands of the east, styling himself King of Men. When word came that Ar-Pharazôn had landed with a host, beyond count, and demanded his surrender, Sauron laughed in secret. He went forth humbly, unarmed and clad in robes of silver, and bowed before the king. "Behold," he said, "the Lord of the West has come. I yield to his power, for it is said that the Valar have forsaken Middle-earth. Let me serve you, O mightiest of men." Ar-Pharazôn, seeing the fair and noble guise of Sauron, was deceived. He took him captive, meaning to bring him in chains to Númenor as a trophy of his victory. Yet within 3 years, Sauron's chains were loosed, and he became the king's most trusted counselor. So swift and subtle was his corruption that many thought him a gift of the Valar, sent to bring them wisdom. Then the true rot began. Sauron whispered in the king's ear, saying, "Why should you fear death? The Valar are not the lords of your fate. They envy you the might you have won. The undying lands lie waiting across the sea. Take them, and make yourself immortal." Thus Sauron planted the seed of ruin. Temples were raised to honor the Lord of Darkness, for Sauron taught them the worship of Morgoth, whom he named the Giver of Life. On the heights of Armenelos, a great temple of black stone was built, whose dome was red as blood in the light of the fires that burned within. There sacrifices were made to the shadow, and the smoke of their offerings rose day and night, a bitter stench over the once holy isle. The faithful were hunted without mercy. Many were slain in secret, and others fled to the eastern colonies where the king's reach was weaker. Among the hunted was Amandil, Lord of Andúnir. But he was not idle. In his heart he remembered the tales of Eärendil and the mercy that had once come from the west. He called his son Elendil to him and said, "Darkness gathers, my son. The king listens now only to lies. I will sail west, though the ban forbids it, and seek the counsel of the Valar. Perhaps they will forgive the folly of men once more." Elendil wept, for he knew the journey would likely mean his father's death. Yet he did not speak against it. "Go then, father," he said, "and may the star of Eärendil guide your way. Whatever comes, I will hold true to your counsel and protect our people." So Amandil set forth in secret upon a small ship, bearing neither weapon nor wealth, only a heart filled with faith. None ever saw him again, though it is said that the Valar heard his plea. Meanwhile, Sauron's hold upon Númenor grew absolute. He flattered the king and filled his mind with dreams of eternal life and mastery over all creation. "The Valar," he said, "deny you immortality because they fear your power. But Morgoth, the true lord, can grant it. Only one act remains to prove your strength. Sail west and take by might what the powers withhold by deceit." And so it came to pass that Ar-Pharazôn gathered the greatest host ever seen since the breaking of the world. From every harbor the ships of Númenor put forth, black sails covering the sea from horizon to horizon. Trumpets blared, and the cries of the host echoed across the waters. Elendil and his sons, Isildur and Anarion, stood upon the western cliffs and watched in silence. "So ends our glory," Elendil said. "This day the shadow of Morgoth returns." Then a great wind arose, and the sea grew dark beneath the fleet of the king. Even as they sailed beyond the sight of the land, the star of Eärendil appeared above the western rim, shining cold and clear. Some say it flickered like a tear upon the face of heaven, as if warning them of doom. But Ar-Pharazôn did not heed it. Pride drove him onward, and beneath the counsel of Sauron he commanded his ships to sail into the forbidden waters beyond the world. There he sought to set foot upon the shores of Aman and claim immortality for himself. Yet no mortal may tread that land unbidden. The Valar looked upon the folly of men and were silent, but Ilúvatar himself moved at last. The world trembled, and the seas rose in wrath. Númenor's doom was upon it. And while the king's fleet vanished into the mists of the west, a dark wind swept back across the world, carrying with it the first tremors of a cataclysm that would soon shake earth and heaven alike. The fleet of Ar-Pharazôn, the Golden, sailed westward upon a sea that had turned to glass. For a time there was no wind, no wave, and no sound save the creak of timbers and the slow beating of the oars. The mariners of Númenor gazed into the still waters and saw there their own faces, pale and strained, and behind them the black banners of the king that trailed upon the sea like wings of night. Then the horizon began to burn. A pale fire flickered in the distance, not of the sun nor of the stars, and a voice seemed to echo in the hearts of the fearful, soft at first, but growing in power, until it was like thunder beneath the world. The captains faltered, but Ar-Pharazôn stood proud upon the prow of his ship, his golden armor gleaming with a false light. "Behold!" he cried. "The land of the Valar lies before us. Long have they hidden their immortality behind walls of sea and cloud. Now we shall take what is denied us. No god shall withstand the might of Númenor." And his people, maddened by pride and terror alike, shouted in answer. The oars bit deep, and the vast armada surged forward. Behind them, the coast of their own isle faded from sight, veiled in mist. Yet in Armenelos, the shadow deepened. The sky had turned to brass, and the air hung heavy as if the breath of the world were failing. Sauron stood upon the steps of the great temple that he had raised to Morgoth, his black robes flowing like smoke in the windless air. Upon his brow burned a crown of iron, and in his hand he held a scepter wrought in the shape of a serpent. He looked westward and laughed, for his work was nearly done. The fires within the temple roared higher, casting a crimson glare over the city. From every street came the cries of those who worshipped the dark power, calling upon their false god to grant victory to their king. But above the tumult, Sauron spoke softly to himself. "The fool goes to claim eternity," he murmured, "and he shall find only the abyss. Yet from his ruin shall my dominion arise, and I shall be lord of the world." At that moment, in the quiet haven of Rhomenna, the faithful watched the black smoke rising from the temple, and felt the earth tremble faintly beneath their feet. Elendil, son of Amandil, knew the hour of doom was come. He gathered his sons, Isildur and Anarion, and the people who had kept faith with the Valar. They had prepared ships in secret, sturdy vessels built not for war, but for flight. Upon each mast they set the star of Eärendil, wrought of silver and crystal, that it might shine as a sign of hope. Elendil spoke to his household as the sea-darkened sky grew strange and low. "The wrath of Ilúvatar is near. The king has broken the ban and seeks to wrest immortality by force. Númenor shall not endure this night. We must flee eastward, though the sea consume us, for the memory of the West must not perish from the earth." Then Isildur, who was strong and bold, said, "Shall we abandon our home and kin to the ruin that comes?" Elendil placed a hand upon his shoulder. "We abandon nothing that can yet be saved. We bear away the seed of our people, and the light that Sauron cannot dim. The rest we commend to the mercy of the One." So they set forth upon the darkened sea. Behind them, the skies over Númenor deepened to a sickly red, and lightning flashed without thunder. The waters grew restless, as though stirred by a power far beneath their depths. Meanwhile, in the forbidden west, Ar-Pharazôn's fleet reached the shores of Aman. The beaches of Valinor gleamed pale beneath a light not of this world, and beyond them rose the mountains of the gods, white and still. But no living soul came forth to meet them. The land was silent, untouched by time. Then the king's pride overcame his fear. He ordered his host to disembark and set foot upon the immortal shore. Trumpets sounded, banners were unfurled, and the hosts of Numenor marched upon the land of the powers. But as the first ranks crossed the boundary between mortal and deathless earth, a great stillness fell. Then the world changed. The sea rose in fury, and the very shape of the earth was broken. The hills of Numenor cracked open, and fire burst forth from their hearts. The temple of Morgoth was thrown down, and the land beneath it yawned wide as a wound. From that chasm poured flame and shadow, and the screams of the perishing filled the night. Sauron, standing upon the pinnacle of his temple, laughed no more. The wave of wrath struck the island with a sound like the breaking of worlds. The mountain Meneltarma split from crown to root, and the cities of Numenor were swallowed by the sea. In that ruin, Sauron's body was destroyed, though his spirit fled back into the darkness of Middle-earth, stripped of its fair form forever. Ar-Pharazôn and his mighty host were buried beneath the lands they had dared to invade. The Valar, moved by Ilúvatar, set a new boundary to the world. Ammon was removed forever from the circles of the earth, and the world was made round, so that no mortal vessel could again find the straight road to the blessed realm. When dawn came, there was no dawn for Numenor. The sea lay empty, save for the wreckage of ships and the few vessels that had escaped by grace alone. Among these were the ships of Elendil and his sons. A great wind carried them eastward, across waters still wild with storm. For many days they drifted, bereft and sorrowing, until at last they beheld the coast of Middle-earth rising out of the mist. There they came ashore in the lands that would later be called Arnor and Gondor. From the ruins of their people, they founded new realms, keeping alive the memory of Numenor and the faith of the West. Upon the white tree that Isildur had saved from the ruin of the king's court, they swore their oaths of loyalty to stand ever against the shadow that had survived its master's fall. And far above, in the vault of heaven, the star of Eärendil still shone. Many of the survivors, standing upon the new shores, lifted their eyes to it and wept. For though their island was lost and their kin perished, yet the light of the star endured, bright as the promise of a dawn yet to come. Elendil stood upon a high cliff overlooking the sea, and the wind of the west brushed his face. "So ends the pride of our fathers," he said softly, "but not the hope of their line. The shadow has not ended, yet neither has the light." And in the silence that followed, the waves whispered of things yet to be, of kingdoms to rise and fall, of battles yet unspoken, and of the One Ring that even then lay hidden in the dark, waiting for the hour of its awakening. For the hatred of Morgoth, though banished with his spirit into the void, had not wholly died. It lingered in the world, a seed of corruption and desire that would bloom again in the heart of Sauron, his greatest servant. And from that remnant of evil would arise a war that would shake not only kingdoms, but the very soul of Middle-earth. But for that moment, upon the newly born shores of the world, the survivors of Numenor stood together, their hearts lifted by the sight of the unchanging star. They built altars of white stone upon the hills and sang hymns of thanksgiving that Eru had preserved them through the ruin. And thus began the second age of the world in truth, a time of renewal and of shadow alike, when the flame of hope was kindled anew in the hearts of men. In the years that followed the downfall of Numenor, the world was remade. The lands that had risen from the sea were new and wild, clothed in untamed forests and mountains not yet marked by the footsteps of men. There, upon the western coasts of Middle-earth, the survivors of the faithful came ashore, weary and grief-stricken, yet unbroken in spirit. Their ships had been cast far apart by storm, but by the grace of Ilúvatar, they found one another again amid the desolate shores. Elendil the Tall was their leader, and beside him stood his sons, Isildur and Anarion. With them were many of noble blood, and craftsmen, mariners and warriors who had escaped the ruin of their isle. They wept for Númenor that was no more, but when they lifted their eyes to the eastern hills, they saw green plains and wide rivers gleaming beneath the sun. There, they resolved, a new realm should rise, one that would remember the light of the West, yet learn wisdom from the grief of the past. Elendil raised his sword and spoke to his people upon the shore. The sea has taken our home, yet not our hope. The Valar have preserved us for a purpose. Here, upon these lands, we will build anew, free from the pride that destroyed our fathers. Let the memory of Númenor be our warning and our guide. Then he named the land where they had come Arnor, the realm of the kings in the north, and there he built his city at Anúminas, beside the waters of Lake Evendim. But his sons journeyed southward along the great river Anduin, where fertile lands stretched wide between mountains and sea. There they founded the realm of Gondor, and its chief cities were Minas Ithil in the shadow of the Ephel Duath, and Osgiliath upon the river's isle, and the high citadel of Minas Anor, looking toward the sunset. Though divided by distance, the two kingdoms were bound as one. The banner of Elendil, white stars upon a field of black, flew over both realms, and the people of Arnor and Gondor called themselves the Dunedain, the men of the West. They were tall and noble, and their memory was long, for the wisdom of Númenor yet lived within them. Upon the walls of their cities, they carved the stories of their past. Of Eärendil, the mariner who won mercy from the Valar, and of the downfall that had come from pride and disobedience. The white tree, brought from Númenor by Isildur, they planted anew in the courts of Minas Ithil, where its leaves shone silver beneath the moon. For a time, peace dwelt among them. The seas were calm, the fields fruitful, and the stars bright above their towers. Yet beyond the mountains, in the shadowed lands of Mordor, a darkness was stirring once more. For though Sauron's body had perished in the ruin of Númenor, his spirit had not been destroyed. It fled, a shadow of malice, back to the ash-choked plains where once his master Morgoth had ruled. There, beneath the smoking peaks of Orodruin, the mountain of fire, Sauron gathered strength again. Slowly he took shape once more, no longer fair and deceitful, but terrible in wrath and power. In secret, he began to rebuild his fortress of Barad-dûr, using the craft he had learned in ages past. From the pits of the earth, he drew his servants, orc and troll, wolf and serpent, and to them he gave new purpose. The land grew foul under his will, rivers turned to blackness, and the very air was heavy with dread. When his strength had grown great once more, he put forth his hand to reclaim the dominion he had lost. He sent messengers to the lesser men of the east and south, promising them power and freedom if they would serve his cause. And to the lands of the Dunedain, he sent no message at all, for he hated them most of all who yet lived, remembering that their fathers had overthrown him before the downfall. So the dark years began. From Mordor came sudden attacks upon the borders of Gondor, raiders from the mountains, beasts from the Black Land, and armies of men corrupted by lies. Isildur and Anarion held firm, fortifying the passes and building great walls upon the borders. The chief of these was the mighty fortress of Minas Anor, which guarded the western approaches, while Minas Ithil watched the east. For long years they fought and held the enemy at bay, but Sauron's strength grew unceasing. At last he came forth himself, terrible to behold, and he assailed Minas Ithil with fire and shadow. The city was taken, and its white tree was burned. Isildur fled northward to his father in Arnor, while Anarion held Osgiliath against the tide of the Dark Lord's hosts. When word of this reached Elendil, he knew that the hour of decision had come. He called together all the lords of Arna, and sent messengers to the elves of Lindon, where Gil-galad, last High King of the Noldor, still ruled beside the sea. Long had there been friendship between their houses, and now they forged it anew. Thus was formed the last alliance of elves and men, the greatest host ever gathered since the War of Wrath. From every corner of the west they came, elves in shining mail, tall warriors of Númenor's line, and banners that shimmered like the dawn. Upon the plain of Eriador, their armies met beneath the stars, and there Elendil and Gil-galad clasped hands. "Once more," said the Elf King, "the shadow of the north reaches forth. But together, as in the elder days, we shall bring it down." And Elendil answered, "As long as the light of Eärendil shines above, hope shall not perish from the world." So began their march into the east. Across the wide lands they passed, over river and mountain, until at last they came to the dark plain before the Black Gate of Mordor. There Sauron's armies awaited them, vast beyond counting. The sky was red with the fire of Orodruin, and the air trembled with the thunder of drums. For 7 years they fought before the gates of Barad-dûr. The plain ran with blood, and neither side gained the upper hand. Yet at last the tide turned, for Anarion was slain by a great stone from the battlements, and Elendil's wrath was kindled. With Gil-galad he pressed the assault, breaking through the outer walls. The battle raged upon the slopes of Orodruin itself, and there at last Sauron came forth, black and vast, wielding a mace that felled all before him. Elendil and Gil-galad together withstood him, but both were slain. Then Isildur, his father's sword broken beneath him, took up the hilt and struck at Sauron's hand, cutting the one ring from his finger. With that blow, the Dark Lord was overthrown, and his spirit fled into the shadows. The war was ended. The hosts of Mordor were scattered, and the Black Gate fell silent. But the victory was dearly bought, for the kings of elves and men were gone, and their people wept upon the field of ruin. Then Elrond and Círdan, who had survived the battle, came to Isildur and urged him to destroy the ring in the fire of Orodruin, for they knew the evil bound within it. But Isildur looked upon the golden band, fair and shining in the firelight, and his heart was tempted. "This is a weregild for my father and brother," he said. "By it the house of Elendil shall be avenged." Thus he kept the ring, though it whispered to him in secret. And though the Dark Tower was broken and the shadow banished for a time, the seed of its return had already been sown. So ended the Second Age in triumph and sorrow, as all great ages must. Yet still the star of Eärendil shone bright above the western sea, and its light fell upon the graves of the fallen kings, a promise that even in death the hope of the West would not wholly fade. The black smoke of Orodruin had long since thinned, drifting eastward over the ruined plain, yet the air of Mordor remained heavy with dread. The battle was ended, but the ground still trembled faintly beneath the weight of the mountain's heart. There, among the ashen stones, Isildur, son of Elendil, stood alone beside the shattered form of his father. The last light of the fires gleamed on his mail, and his face was pale and worn, for he had fought through fire and grief alike. At his feet lay the hilt of Narsil, the sword that had shone in the wars of Númenor. Its blade was broken, yet a single shard still glimmered faintly in the red light. Isildur knelt and took it up, pressing the steel to his brow. "Father," he murmured, "your work is done, but mine remains." Then he turned to where Sauron had fallen. Of the Dark Lord's vast form, only ruin remained, armor rent and blackened, smoke rising from the ground where his body had been. Yet even in death, a shadow lingered there, shapeless and watchful, like a wound upon the world. And amid that shadow, something shone faintly, gold and terrible. It was a simple ring, small and fair, but the fire of the mountain gleamed within it like the reflection of a dark sun. Isildur reached down and lifted it from the ashes. The metal was warm to his touch, almost alive, and for a moment he felt it stir in his hand. Then a voice, soft and low, seemed to whisper within his mind, words of power, promise, and remembrance. He held it aloft, and those who stood near him saw the light of it reflected in his eyes. "This is mine by right," Isildur said, "the weregild of my father and my brother. By this, the house of Elendil shall be avenged." Elrond and Círdan came to him then, their garments dark with ash, their faces grave. "Cast it into the fire," Elrond urged, pointing to the molten chasm from which the ring had been born. "Destroy it, and the shadow that clings to it will be ended forever. For while it remains, Sauron's spirit will endure." But Isildur's gaze was fixed upon the ring, and he did not hear them. The weight of it in his hand was light, yet his heart grew heavy. He felt within it a strange power, a warmth that whispered of glory and mastery, of secrets beyond mortal reach. It was beautiful and terrible, and his will faltered. "No," he said softly, closing his fist around it. "It is precious to me now. It is a token of my victory and the remembrance of my grief. I will keep it." Elrond's eyes darkened, but he said no more. "So be it," he murmured. "But I fear that what you hold is not a gift, but a curse. The shadow of Sauron will not depart while it endures." Then they gathered the fallen and departed from Mordor. The tower of Barad-dûr, though broken, still stood in ruin, and none dared linger within its shadow. The armies of elves and men withdrew, bearing their dead in silence. Gil-galad and Elendil were laid to rest upon high mounds, and their banners were raised above them, the silver star of the north and the blue and white of the Noldor. For a time the world seemed still, as if weary from so much strife. When Isildur returned to Gondor, the people greeted him with reverence and sorrow. Anarion was gone, slain in the siege, and the throne stood empty. There, upon the ruined steps of Osgiliath, Isildur spoke to his captains. "This realm I will give to my brother's son to govern in my stead, for I will return north to Arnor, where the crown of our house must rest." Then he commanded that the white tree, last scion of Nimloth of Númenor, be planted anew in the court of Minas Anor, that its light might bless the kingdom. "May it stand as a sign," he said, "that though darkness may fall, the seed of hope shall live." Yet even as he spoke, the ring lay hidden upon a chain about his neck, and its whispering grew stronger with each passing day. He wore it often in secret, and its touch filled him with restless thought. In dreams he saw visions of power, armies bending the knee, lands united under his rule, the stars themselves reflected in a crown of fire. From Gondor he journeyed north, and a small company went with him. warriors of his household, proud and loyal. They crossed the Duath and passed through the wild lands between the mountains and the river. The forests there were ancient and dim, haunted by strange cries, but the ring whispered to Isildur that no harm could touch him. He began to grow careless, trusting in its unseen strength. Then, one morning, as they followed the river Gladden through a narrow vale, they were set upon by orcs. The remnants of Sauron's armies, scattered and leaderless, had crept back into the shadows, and hunger drove them to fury. The attack came swiftly. Arrows rained from the trees, and the Dunedain fell beneath them. Isildur fought bravely, wielding the shards of Narsil, but the orcs were without number. When all his guard were slain, he took the ring and placed it upon his finger, vanishing from sight. He fled toward the river, meaning to cross and escape, but the ring, treacherous even then, betrayed him. It slipped from his hand as he swam, gleaming once in the water before sinking into the dark. At that moment, the orcs saw him and loosed their arrows. One struck his breast, another his throat. Isildur fell, and the current bore his body away, out of sight of friend and foe alike. Thus perished the king of Gondor and Arnor, and with him was lost the Ring of Power. For long years the ring lay hidden in the depths of the river, forgotten by all save the whispering darkness that yet lingered in the world. The realms of the Dunedain endured, fair and strong, but the shadow of their glory began slowly to wane. The years grew colder, and the memory of the elder days faded into legend. Still, in the north, Elrond kept watch from Rivendell, and the heirs of Isildur ruled in the wild, guarding the remnants of their people. They became the Rangers, unseen yet steadfast, carrying within their blood the promise of kingship long deferred. In Gondor, the white tree continued to bloom, though its light grew dim as the centuries passed. The Tower of Minas Anor was renamed Minas Tirith, the Tower of Guard, for the people feared that the shadow might one day rise again in the east. And far away, beneath the ash and stone of Mordor, Sauron's spirit stirred once more, slow and patient. The ring had not been destroyed, and through it, his will yet clung to the world. The earth remembered his hatred, and his eye, though formless, sought endlessly for that which was lost. So ended the Second Age of the world, with victory turned to sorrow and hope bound in secrecy. Yet above the fading lands, the star of Eärendil still shone, unchanged, unyielding, a silent witness to both triumph and ruin. It gleamed upon the waves where Númenor once had stood, and upon the high towers of the Dunedain's new realms, whispering of light beyond the shadow. For though the fires of evil would burn anew in the ages to come, still the memory of the West endured in the hearts of the faithful, and the name of Elendil was not forgotten. And somewhere, deep beneath the river's cold waters, the One Ring slept, waiting for the hand that would awaken it again, and with it, the wrath and hatred of Morgoth's last and greatest servant.